My name is Alan Grice, and the article that I chose to do my presentation on was about the verbal and non-verbal expressions of men's sexism in mixed gender interactions. It focused on two types of sexism, the first one being benevolent sexism and the second one being hostile sexism. Benevolent sexism is the polite attitude that men have towards women that feels favorable, but it's actually sexist because it casts women as weaker creatures in need of men's protection. A primary example of this would be a man opening a door for a woman, a man paying for her dinner, or a man having the wife stay at home as he is the breadwinner. It kind of casts women as in need of a man to function in everyday life. And the second form of sexism was hostile sexism, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It is the hostile attitude men have towards women, who are often viewed as trying to control men through feminist ideology or sexual seduction. So how can you test this? A private university in New England paired 27 U.S. male and female undergraduate students together and conducted a survey. The survey consisted of two interactions. The first one was a trivia game that had 20 questions, which ranged from easy, medium, and hard questions. And then after the survey, they had an unscripted, unstructured conversation, roughly from 3 to 5 minutes, about any topic they could choose. Basically, they cut the cameras off, quote unquote, and allowed them to interact with each other one-on-one to kind of see how they would interact. During this process, they examined the gender interactions of the hostile sexist men and benevolent sexist men. They were looking at tone of speech, they were looking at body language, and they were looking at word use. The hypothesis that they tested, there was actually three. The first hypothesis was that benevolent sexist men should be more affiliated in their nonverbal and verbal expressions. The second one was the second hypothesis was that hostile sexist men should be less affiliated in their nonverbal and verbal expressions. So you have the extreme opposite ends of the scale. You have benevolent sexist men who are going to be more nonverbal and wanting to be more, caregivers to women, and on the opposite end of the spectrum you have the hostile men who are going to have less affiliated in their nonverbal and verbal expressions, so they're going to be a little more standoffish, less involved in the conversation. And the third hypothesis that they wanted to test, it built on the second one, and that was that they wanted to predict that hostile sexist men would not only be less nonverbal and less verbal in their expressions, but in those expressions they would be more dominant and more sort of putting themselves in a power play figure to control the conversation. So after this study, it was interesting because while this is going on, they actually had two lab assistants who were viewing the conversation primarily on video. There was no sound, nothing. They were only watching the nonverbal cues, while the women who partake in the survey, they were asked to basically write down on a scale of 1 to 10 how hostile or non-hostile or how verbal and non-verbal they felt each man was during their interactions. So what did they discover? They discovered that hypothesis 1 and that hypothesis 2 were supported by the evidence. The third one, not so much. That's more of a biased opinion and that they found, so that the evidence showed that in order for someone to be dominant in the conversation, that's really kind of an opinion of the person. These findings really, they progress the theoretical understanding of sexism, and that benevolent sexism is expressed differently than hostile sexism at an interpersonal level, not just at an ideological level. And that just goes to show you that sometimes it's not just the actions and words that we use, it's also the nonverbal cues, like holding open a door, that can be seen as men being sexist in an everyday thing, in an everyday manner. That's my presentation on verbal and nonverbal expressions of men's sexism and mixed gender interactions. I hope you found it interesting. I sure did.